Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Getting Future Fit. It is about 2 minutes past 2, so I think we will kick on. I think we'll probably see a few people continuing to join, but let's soldier on for all of you that were here on the button of 2 and a little before. We came here today to talk about the future, but actually, before we talk about the future, I want to start by talking about the past, by going back 600 years. I might just switch on my camera, I suppose. Your camera's off. Thank you, Kevin. You think after this long of doing this, we'd be good at this stuff by now. I'd like to go back 600 years, back to Japan in about the 1400s, and the Japanese art of kintsugi. For those of you that don't know of the Japanese art of kintsugi, it's this whole idea, an ethos, if you like, a philosophy of taking something that was broken and then using lacquer which had gold or silver or platinum in it, using that glue to put the piece back together again to make something more beautiful than it was before. And I should probably mention at this point that it's an analogy that I have to attribute to Kevin, who you'll hear from in a second, before I get a trademark infringement notice. Totally his idea that I completely pinched. But if you think about it, it's a wonderful analogy for what we're going through at the moment, because in some ways, the pandemic and all the things that have gone with it, the lockdowns, the work at home, the remote working, the impact on business, it has broken our organizations in a way, in some places. It has broken cultures in a way, in some places. And as we piece that world back together, wow, we've got an amazing opportunity to piece it back together into something which is maybe better and maybe more fit for purpose than it was before. It's the biggest opportunity probably that we've had in decades when you think about the world of work. And this opportunity to change something, to change things arguably for the better, is not to be missed, certainly in Kevin and my opinion. We talk about being future fit. But what does that actually mean? What does it mean to be future fit? You know, when I think about it, and this is Kevin and I's perspective, this is the perspective of people that we're talking to, it's our clients, it's what we're reading. What is it about future fit organizations? What makes a future fit business? Well, for us, it's a chunk of things. And look, these things are going to be different for your businesses and your organizations. That's a really good question to ask yourself. What's a future fit business mean for us? And certainly at a very high level, some of the things that we're seeing are things like being purpose-led, having trusted leadership, having psychologically safe places, thinking about performance. And we're going to hear a good bit about that over the course of the next hour or so. And also, of course, managing underperformance, that we've got really strong employer brands and EVPs in order to attract and retain really good people. Sustainability is a word we are hearing more and more, and investors, if you're in a listed company, are looking really strongly at your sustainability practices in order to make investment decisions. You know, overall for us, it's about balancing employer and employee needs and wants as you go forward. And, you know, as I said, it's a once in a generation opportunity to do this. It really is. And that might not be about changing everything dramatically or radically. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But it's about making change that makes a difference for your organization. These things are happening anyway, right? So let's do it in a thoughtful way. Let's do it in a way that brings people on the journey with you. Quick note, don't panic. Do not scribble like mad. We will send the slides out after. This is not the most beautiful presenting deck that Kevin and I have ever put together, but we did want it to be as practical as it possibly could be. So there's tons of content in here. Don't panic, don't scribble. We will send the slides out after, I promise. I suppose it begs the question, for those of you who don't know us, who are you two to be talking about this stuff? What do you know that we don't know already? And the answer is maybe a little, maybe not a little. From my perspective, my background's in communications. I run Inspiring Change. We are a consultancy who is dedicated to helping organizations connect with your people, about helping them to connect to strategy, and purpose and change programs, helping leaders to connect teams and people in your organization to each other. And for us, that's about a very strong focus on really human internal comms, really human leadership, employee engagement, and all of those things combining to help create really, really solid cultures in your organizations. Kevin.
Thank you, Scott, and welcome everybody this afternoon. So I'm a founder of Work Matters, and essentially that's a future of work consulting and training firm set up in 2017 to help with the people and leadership challenges that were already happening as a result of a rapidly changing world of work, or so we thought it was at the time. I had been working and researching in that space for a number of years before that, and the context for our work, I guess, at that time, interestingly, when you look back just a few years, would have been around, and probably still is, around digital transformation, automation, organizational agility, workforce planning, and other workforce and workplace trends that were really prevalent at the time and still are. And I guess when you talked about the future of work just a few years back, even a year back, it was probably this sort of sprawling subject, really, wasn't it? It was turning up in different ways and with different levels of urgency for different organizations in different sectors. So, like if you were at the sharp end, for instance, of it, and your job was being automated, well, you knew all about the future of work. But for others, it was more of something that was happening in the future. It hadn't quite landed yet, although it was something that was coming, and there was certainly no shortage of hype around the topic. But as they say, the future is not quite what it used to be. And COVID has certainly brought into sharp focus a lot of these trends that were happening at the time, and that we're seeing them concentrating now towards this present day. So, in many ways, as a result of COVID, we're all in this together now, and we're considering together what the next phase of work is going to look like. We're facing into probably the second biggest challenge or change in working life that we've seen in a generation or more. And I say the second because the first was only 12 months ago. When we were all, and I say all, and I'm very conscious, as is Scott, that we're not talking about all categories of jobs and roles here. But in terms of those that have the option regarding where they work and in knowledge work, etc., and office kind of work, we were thrown into a huge petri dish a year ago, and now we are facing probably an equally challenging change to the world of work now into the next phase. And we'll talk a bit more about that now to come. So that's what brings us here together to discuss what we're heading into and how we might approach it. The plan for the next hour or so is just to share with you some practical ideas and experiences of what we've all learned collectively. And I don't mean just the kind of COVID learnings, although they're very important and you need to think about what those are for you, but also the learnings from other big workforce changes that have been going on in the last few years, other attempts that have been many, some successful and some not so, at going towards more remote working, hybrid working models like Yahoo and IBM, Honeywell, very, very public stories from nearly 10 years old in terms of people who have been trying to move to this new model of work that we're now talking about today. So we're going to share a little bit about that. We're going to talk about the opportunity, probably the most common word you'll hear, and certainly a theme of today, which is this opportunity that presents itself. And the question is, of course, for you, what's the scale of that opportunity? Is it a case that your organization doing just fine as it was pre-COVID? You've been doing well, and you just need to simply get back to a new model, a hybrid model of work? Is that the opportunity, just to kind of adopt that new hybrid world? Or at the other end of the scale, is there actually a wider, bigger opportunity around really fixing some of those pieces that Scott was talking about, in terms of maybe culture and leadership, ways of working, that actually this is an opportunity to begin a journey, if you like, that's going to be much more profound in terms of how work gets done and where it gets done, etc. We'll talk about the barriers and the kind of issues that you probably need to bake in, if you like, to your change program. And we'll share with you a framework. We sort of tried to bring these lessons and ideas and experiences together into a 4-phase framework, try saying that, and that we hope would be just like a template for you to fill in yourself in terms of your own circumstances and use as a tool with your teams as you go forward. Your voice is really important to us here. So Q&A all the way through, and we'll attempt to get to some stuff at the end. We're going to maybe stay on a bit longer for those who want to do that or respond afterwards, or hopefully we'll have time to address them all as we are. But please do put questions or comments in the chat as well. So what have we learned, right? Well, I guess a lot is probably the answer, isn't it? I mean, and this is all very personal to all of us in terms of our own organizations. But the one thing we always hear when we're talking to folks is, well, what's your COVID learnings, etc. Well, we've learned that we can work this way. We maybe never thought we could, or we never thought to this extent, but we have actually kind of really learned. We've learned a hell of a lot about remote working. And the question for you, and certainly some word that keeps coming up for us, is trust. And maybe that was the biggest barrier to remote working not being as prevalent as it was before. But of course, we were all jettisoned into a situation of forced trust, if you like. And that has gone very well for some. Others where trust was an issue, it has remained an issue in these times. But it's certainly a very interesting theme as we approach the next phase as to the trust issue and how we kind of build on that. We know a lot more about work and what we can do and where best to do it. We have all experimented. We have all tried things. We've tried and failed. We've adopted practices, brought practices into the COVID world that simply were just exhausting and unsustainable, and we've changed. And also our leaders too, and the people managers have had to adapt and change. And in one sense, it's been a great leveler, hasn't it, in terms of workforce and workplace learning. And I think that's another real important nugget that we can bring forward, that leaders have had to be vulnerable. They've had to admit they haven't known all the answers. We've had to all try our best and be kind to each other in the last year or so. So can we bring some of that learning, some of that behavior forward? We've learned a hell of a lot about work and home, haven't we, in terms of that blend. And some of us look forward to the day when we can kind of come back from a workplace and put the key in the door and have that boundary between work and home. Others are saying, nope, I wanted this forever. This suits me fine. But there's a lot of discussion about, well, what the new world is going to bring and how we kind of recreate, if you like, or bring back in that sense of human connection, not just amongst family and friends, but with our work colleagues. So we know that there's a ton of stuff that we've learned, and we've got very interesting templates and tools if you're interested in terms of just trying to kind of capture those learnings and bring them forward, and also consign some ways of working that we've had to do in the last 12 months, consign them to the bin. We do not want to see them again, because we now have a choice. We have maybe a choice as to what kind of work gets done remotely and what is best done, if you like, together. So that's the point, and I think we're looking at a lot of change, and we'd love to hear, I guess, in looking at that, what your thoughts are regarding those changes and journeys. And we certainly know, don't we, that the new shape of work is flexible. It's no surprise that. And again, we have to qualify that with some categories of work. But even those on the front line, in healthcare, in retail, you're seeing very fundamental shifts now about how work can get done in the background, and the whole supply chain issue in terms of automation, etc. There's fundamental change right across the piece. But we'd love to ask you just a few questions, just to get some conversation going on this topic. The first one is, to what extent, in terms of planning, to what extent has your organization formulated plans for a post-COVID work model and back to office strategy? Haven't really started, just developing the strategy, just really haven't started yet, or it's currently being developed, but we haven't really got into detailed planning. Or yes, actually, we have a pretty clear strategy now, but and we're starting to really actively plan. Or strategy and planning done, actually, and we're in implementation mode, transition mode. Which of those would suit you? Best describe where you're at.
Just give you another 10 seconds to stick in your answer. And remember, we don't know who said what, so be completely honest. We won't tell anybody, promise. Just last few seconds. Okay, so let's have a quick look at this. Interesting, when we, it's interesting when you look at where you are, a chunk of people, 7% down the bottom there, really far ahead of the group. Equally, a group at the other end, similarly, who haven't started developing yet, but really strong numbers in that second category, with the strategy being developed, but planning not yet started. Kevin, we move on to the second.
Yeah, why not?
Chunk?
Yes, and then we'll have a look at them all together then in a sec. That's great.
Let's have a look at Q2.
Now, I know it's not all about how many days in the office. I know that question is probably getting very boring, but just to level set and get a sense, because no matter how trite that question is, it's still the one that keeps coming up. So assuming your plans involve some continued remote working, where the role permits it, that is, how many days will likely be office-based in the future? Fully remote, as in none in the office, 1 to 2 days, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. Full-time office space, we want everybody back. And then, no, just we don't even go there. It's just going to be discretionary, and we're not getting caught into that trap of defining how many days. What best describes you?
We'll just give you another 10 seconds to just throw your answers in there, or maybe even 5, given that most of you have done it now. I think what's really interesting with this one is that there's no right answer. Twitter is coming out and saying we want everybody remote. Other organizations are saying we want everybody in. There's some in between. There's no one single answer, which I think is the really interesting thing about this, which is why that whole, for me, discretionary piece is probably important. Definitely something to have a look at. We move on, Kevin?
So, yes, so that's great. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, third question.
So this is more about, so that's what you guys are thinking from maybe an employer perspective, but I'm just wondering from conversations and thoughts you have amongst the employee base, do you foresee differences in what you as employers, if you like, are thinking and what employees are expecting regarding flexible work arrangements? And do you expect this to be an issue, basically, the difference in employer and employee expectations? Yes, a significant issue. Yes, but we should be okay. We'll get around it. It's just a bit of comms. No, it's not an issue. We're aligned, or just don't know.
Just give you another maybe 2 or 3 seconds there. You've pretty much all got your responses in there, I think. Okay. So there's the final results. Yes, but we don't expect it to be a big issue. Great. But big chunk that it will be significant. And that's obviously something to be considering, and very little in the knows and don't know. So that's.
Don't see that, Scott, by the way. Doesn't know.
Oh, apologies.
Yeah.
Sorry, Kevin. Apologies.
You're keeping that all to yourself.
I know. I keep forgetting to hit the share results button. You think I'd be used to this by now?
So 33, big issue. 53, it's an issue, but not so much. And smaller amounts. So there's some kind of an issue there to be dealt with. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I mean, hopefully some of that data will be interesting for you and your teams. But maybe, Scott, just a couple of, so this is just a bunch now, as Scott said, we have failed every possible feasible test of good PowerPoint presentation skills. So we're not apologizing for that. We're just going to try and get you some information. But it's just to show some of the data that we've been gathering over the last couple of months on those same topics. And very, very interesting. I think the strategy one exactly about the same, I think. 52% actually exactly the same in terms of strategy and model being developed, but the planning hasn't quite started yet. And 34% versus 30 on, yes, we have a clear enough strategy, and we're actively planning now. So that middle section seems to be where people are at. And on the days, I think you can see there that by far the most common is sort of the 2 to 3 days in the office. And again, that was your most prevalent kind of score as well. So what we share, I think we'll be able to share those poll results, won't we, Scott, afterwards as well too.
Yep, should be.
The expectation one is just an interesting one there, bottom left from CPL. And it's just one of the things that just pop up. This is an employee only piece of research where 18% of employees were expecting that they'd be able to go fully remote at the end of this this sort of period in terms of new. So it's just begging a question about that change challenge, if you like, that we're going to be facing. Now, so in terms of those strategies, what are we seeing? And again, we just thought we'd share with you, I suppose, some of the lessons learned. Again, not necessarily just from those who are at the front end. And some folks have been planning this post-COVID work model, if you like, design and strategy since the summer last. And usually because they had to, usually because there was some big property issue going on, some real estate or big transformation program where they had to make those kind of calls early, or at least they were trying to make some calls early regarding the hybrid work model. It was going to be part of their new business model. And we know that those when you transition from, say, 1 to 2 days in the office to 2 to 3 days in the office, you are crossing a line into, if you like, an almost employee type benefits, if you like, or accommodation, into a very significant change to the way business is done and business is run. When you're saying that, 2 or 3 days in the office is probably what you expect of people, it's very much a hybrid. So for those who are moving in that direction, what were some of the learnings that they picked up? There's 3 buckets, I would say, of learning: sort of strategy, design, and implementation. And on the strategy side, if you like, a strong foundation, this idea of a clear leadership vision and principles and some consensus around that. Some concept model, as one client puts it, around the future work model basics and parameters and principles, getting a sense of that early on. And putting some clear and honest comms around that too, that we don't know all the answers. This is what we think for our business is going to be required. This is our starting position in terms of testing and trialing, if you like. And we're going to set up a governance process around technology, workplace, people, to ensure that that gets done. So that sort of foundation layer, and coming back to that question of Callie Williams, is, coming back as an overriding principle: what do we need to get done for our business, and how and where can we do that best? That's a kind of, if you like, a continuous kind of principle or a question that has been asked in the design phase. And in that design phase, then moving from concept to testing and trialing some kind of new work model, scenario testing, persona or activity analysis, in order to test the concept to see, does that 2 to 3 days work, or does it fall flat in its face? How are we going to accommodate everybody in at the same time, etc. Those kind of experimentations, and really a chance to engage as well leadership. An openness to experimentation and piloting into the future as well. For instance, one organization saying, we're going to try a trial that 2 days offsite is the going in position, in order for people to really grapple with the blend and the hybrid kind of model. And we'll see, and we'll learn from that, and we'll iterate, and using that agile approach. And this is where the huge opportunity, of course, does come. Even in the way we transition to our new model, is providing us with an opportunity to try different ways of working, to be experimental, to be agile, to get feedback in the loop, learning, and iteration and measurement, rather than pretending we have some kind of one size fits all perfect answer. So a lot of work in the design and testing phase, and then in the implementation, lots of talk about, yes, there's so many things that are going to be impacted, from performance management to rewards to training, but we're going to focus on some high impact culture and process priorities in order to enable this hybrid model to be successful. We're not going to be able to do everything. We're going to have to shunt some stuff into next year or beyond. This is a multi-year program, probably. Let's focus on the key issues and get management involvement particularly involved. And remember, people are going to be tired, and they're going to be needing involvement, support, and encouragement and enablement through this process with targeted tooling and training for the transition phase. So there's some of the early lessons. And one of the things, because of this gap between employee and employer expectations, the idea of making sure we manage confidently the conversation and engage and enable and communicate in the way that Scott was talking about as a very, very important discipline, if you like, in this multidisciplinary change agenda and approach. So it's clear that there's a lot of opportunity here. And again, depending on the scale of ambition that you have. But Scott, you're going to take us through maybe what some of those opportunities might be.
So let's have a think now that if you have your strategy in place, and really it's all about how you enhance the culture of your organization, the productivity of your organization, and that if you think about opportunity, it's really easy to bounce out of bed in the morning and go, oh my God, this hybrid working model is going to be amazing. There's so many benefits. There's so much opportunity for us and for people. But actually, that maybe Pollyanna approach to the whole thing mightn't be just right. You know, for us, I think it's about being perhaps a little bit more balanced, a little bit more realistic. If you think about it, on March the 12th last year, we were kind of thrown into this whole thing. It was just foisted upon us. And now, really, it's about narrowing down the lens, focusing on what's going to make a difference in the next phase coming up, as Kevin just said. For me, there are definitely opportunities, but we have to balance them to make a point. So let's have a look at a few of them now. So when you think about the opportunity of talent, and that's a huge one that people are talking about an awful lot, access to a much wider pool of talent. As organizations, that's going to mean that you're at risk of losing your people because your people are in that talent pool. So having a much greater focus on EVP, why your people want to stay, your employee value proposition, is going to be really, really important, as is the whole idea of employer brand, of making sure that you've created something that people are drawn to, that new talent wants to come and join. Of course, if you fail to take advantage of this, then you fail to attract and retain amazing talent, and you become less competitive as a result. Next up, an opportunity to benefit from building an agile work model. It's really important, that idea of really, truly embedding new ways of working. Of course, from a threat perspective, if you're coming from an organization that has a very old, settled culture, which is very set in its ways, that whole idea of building an agile culture mightn't suit the people or mightn't suit the type of culture you have in your organization right now. Why is that bad? And what happens if you fail to take advantage of that? Well, it becomes a one-off change program, which would be an awful shame, because this is a huge opportunity to learn new ways of doing things, new ways of implementing change for the next 20 years or 30 years, not just for the next 12 perhaps or 18 months. You won't bring that change capability with you. Perhaps this is a great opportunity to really flatten the pyramid, to think about a focus on servant leadership, which is getting a louder and louder voice, to let go of those more traditional management practices, that whole hierarchy of top-down command and control. But of course, you know, as I've said in almost every session that I run, you know, people leaders are the most important people in your organization, and that change does put them under pressure. Of course, like the rest of us, they're already stretched and tired. Now, the flip side of that coin is that if you fail to take advantage, you end up going back to where you were, reverting to those old leadership practices, the old ways of doing things, and then trying to apply those in this new work model, whatever that ends up looking like as you move forward. Opportunity 4, one for me, which is key, an opportunity to change how you communicate with people to improve that sense of connection. Because people now, if they're in the office, maybe as you've just said there, for 2 or 3 days a week, and they're out the other 2 days, and those 2 or 3 days don't always overlap, you may not see people from week to week. That sense of connection starts to be eroded. What's that going to need? What's the threat there? Well, it is going to need investment of money, of time, of effort, of leaders doing different things, again, stacking more into the briefcases of your people leader team. You fail to take advantage and you keep stuffing square pegs into round holes. You've got remote teams or people that are semi-remote. You're still trying to do your team meetings on Zoom. They don't work. Nobody looks at different ways of doing things. And there are plenty out there. I was only on my podcast yesterday chatting to a lady whose company does internal podcasts. So the human voice. So now rather than reading lots of emails or documents, we're able to listen to the CEO, the HRD, or our colleagues telling stories and getting their communications out that way. Way more human and really new. Well worth a look. 5th, this whole idea of technology adoption. You know, if I think about that at the very basic level, and it's not about robots and it's not about AI and it's not about all that stuff for the most of us, it's about things like Office 365 And it's about, and Kevin and I were laughing the other day because I said to him, when we're doing this deck, we'll just put it up and we'll co-author. He said, oh my God, I'm going to have to get out of the habit of emailing you back versions. I said, yeah, you are. Yeah, because we're not doing that anymore. We're going to co-author the document so we have one version. But for some people in organizations, that's going to be hard. That's just not what they're used to. It's not what they like doing. They like to save a version, give it a version number, and share it with the team. So does that then as a threat create a them and us, depending on the adoption among people? Yeah, it does. But of course, fail to take advantage and you don't maximize the return on investment of that technology investment you've made, because it's probably sitting there in many of your organizations now, and all you're using is Teams or Word or PowerPoint, and none of those tools to help with a hybrid work model to help people work collaboratively. Last, but by no means least, is very much around kind of reimagining that whole workplace experience and reducing property costs. And I know, and I'm hearing already that, we have to make this hybrid working thing work, because in 2 or 3 years' time, our property plans mean we're only going to have desks for half of our staff at any given point in time. We're going to be moving everybody from having that little 2 square meters of desk space, which is mine, my area with my stuff and the picture of my kids and my phone and my mug in my drawer. We're moving away from that to something which is bring your stuff with you. Use a desk or use a workspace or use a phone booth or use a spot in the library if you're doing quiet work, and then move somewhere else after. That's a massive change in mindset for people. And it's really critical, massive threat if you underestimate the impact of that change. Of course, if you fail to properly reimagine that workplace experience, you end up with the workplace becoming very transactional. It was a place we used to go to socialize, to meet people, to have a coffee, to have a chat. Positioned poorly, the workplace becomes a very transactional environment where I go to have a meeting and that's it. And then I leave and it's a bit rubbish. So there are massive opportunities, but of course, behind everyone is a threat and just an opportunity to do something a bit different, but consider it in the context of what could also go wrong. As I say, don't run in with that Pollyanna-esque view of the world that it's all going to be amazing, because it mightn't be. It just mightn't be. Kevin.
So, Scott, I think that those opportunities, and indeed the flip side in terms of the threats, in terms of baking those both opportunities and the challenges, if you like, into our change planning, I guess that's the sort of purpose around this slide before we get into talking about the framework. And you'll see these themes reoccurring, but certainly, if you were to summarize the kind of main hurdles in all of these transitions that I've spoken about, both since COVID and before, there's sort of four communities that are really critical that we have a plan around. The leadership, people managers, employees, and then our colleagues, if you like, in terms of workplace and technology and facilities, and change in comms, those kind of disciplines, and how we integrate those. Because certainly, we've talked about the necessity for, senior management and leadership, vision and commitment. People will see through that. The second point about a lack of clarity and trust and buy-in. People are looking to their leaders for the role modeling, for the cues, if you like, that are we serious about this change, or are the values, if you like, are the things that we really value and recognize around here, have they changed? A small example, one organization that's already started to move people back in the office are saying that there's habits beginning to happen, that people are looking for in terms of looking at Microsoft, the calendar function, who else is in the office? I'll make my mind up when I go in, when I know who else is in. And if it's a leader or a manager that I should be around, then I'll make a decision around that. Not great in terms of early signals as to the reason why one would go into the office and not go into the office. So the idea of making sure that we've got that senior leadership commitment and vision about really making it a safe place now to experiment, to try new ways of working, and for them to be vulnerable in that kind of process. And the line manager, the population, huge empathy for that group who've had a tough time this last year, and they're going to be even in a tougher time now. I mean, some of us would have seen, again, very public announcements about what people are doing, like PwC saying, come to work anytime, leave anytime, it's up to you. And that's wonderful. And probably PwC perhaps have a culture where that's going to work fine. But the danger with some of those pronouncements is it's the line manager who's going to be left to pick up the pieces of that in terms of being the bad cop, trying to maybe bring the team back together in terms of having a new rhythm and way of working in order for to adopt the kind of hybrid world and manage somehow all the expectations as well as the performance output requirements of that group. So the people management, enablement, and empathy with them. What we've noticed is that leaders and managers need a bit more time to get their head around this new model than perhaps we accounted for at the beginning. Oh, they'll get it. This is great. This is opportunities that Scott's talking about. They'll all kind of get it, right? But actually, it takes time for people to grapple with some of the reality of this. And so not to underestimate that. And to bring people with us along the way as well, so that they really begin to see they're sort of got their fingerprints, if you like, in the design of the work model. We know from the research we're doing how engaged they are in these kind of research questions about what do you think should the next phase be, should be. If there's going to be more flexibility, what do you think the implications to team productivity and customer impact are going to be? That sort of level of involvement and engagement in the next phase, rather than a top-down announcement. And then to really think about the change, and not to underestimate the change. There's been a hell of a lot of change in the last year, so maybe we need to think about how do we chunk up the change in terms of what we can do this year, but also then how do we continue the change process into next year and beyond, and thinking mindfully about that. So they're just some of the hurdles that we need to sort of build in or bake into our plan.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. We're hurtling down a road, and we've most of us either got plans underway or plans in train. But I think from Kevin and my perspective is, before you start, stop and take some time, because right now it's really easy for us all to jump into doing mode. And trust me, I am the guy who jumps into doing mode. But actually, sometimes it's best just to stop and think about the broader implications, perhaps the longer term implications of the opportunity of right now. Maybe it's not just how do we get people back into the office and what does that look like, but actually, what are the benefits that we need to see in 6 months or 12 months or 18 or 24 months time or 60 months time, and work out right now, what are the building blocks that need to be put in place for that to happen? Because as I said, I think at the top, this is a once in a generation, multi-generation opportunity that it's really, really important not to waste, whether it be a little change that you put in place or a big change. It's such an opportunity to do something different in organizations and bring your people with you on that journey.
So what we've done here, and if we've failed the PowerPoint tests before, we've really died now, but this is a framework we'll be sending on to you. It's like a template of sorts where we've just tried to capture the lessons, the opportunities, and the kind of watch outs, if you like, for a 3 or 4 phase journey, if you like, that you might think about. A template that you can use, discard, put in your own kind of steps into just almost as a checklist as well, for maybe how you've already done. Maybe some of you, judging from those numbers, are already past phase 1. But as we know, and you can see from these returning arrows, that even if you're past phase 1, you may return to challenge some of the assumptions you made in an earlier phase. But broadly speaking, it's a kind of a template that we just think tries to capture in one page the kind of considerations we've been talking about. And I guess what we believe is that this future of work journey is a combination of future of work strategy and design, the what, if you like, and the engagement and enablement agenda, if you like, that on the other hand, which is the how part. And that, I suppose, brings both myself and Scott's kind of like backgrounds. And so we're trying to kind of somehow bring them together for you to give you a sense of what the kind of items of work that need to get done in order to successfully transition, but also how you might go about that to ensure that the energy, the commitment, the communication, the enablement agenda is also kept up in parallel. So we're going to go through these 4 steps, and the first step broadly is about setting up for success. The second step is about scoping and planning the work. The third step is about really enabling the transition, if you like. And the fourth one is about how do we maintain and sustain that beyond, if you like, that first day back, if you like, that we can get people back. So 4 steps that we'll just go through very quickly before we cut off for some questions. So the first one is this idea about setting up for success, and where that leadership engagement really comes in, taking that time to really help them, coach them, get their heads around what's coming next, provide them with some data and research, ensure that they are both supported but challenged as well, maybe in some of their thinking around this, and with them develop the concept model, if you like, and the principles of this new work model that they are going to kind of lead, if you like. Maybe put some manners around it in terms of shaping and scoping the scale of this change. Are we going to be a follower here in terms of just kind of get the minimal amount of work done to get us back? Or are we thinking about a multi-year change where we're really going to bring forward some important transformation objectives, perhaps linking the new model of work with other things that we're trying to do as an organization as well in terms of digital transformation, workforce transformation, and so on. So sizing and scoping the scale of the challenge we have, because that then decides, well, what kind of governance model we need, what kind of PMO, what kind of setup we're going to need to be successful. Certainly some of the projects that I've seen in programs are under probably resourced for the scale of the change that they have in their mind. So as well as this, there's a bit of business case work in terms of have we actually looked at the hard and soft costs and benefits from both the employee and the employer point of view? Have we thought about the sustainability agenda? So there's just some of the things that we don't have to do all at once before we move on to the next step, but certainly need to be captured in your plan somewhere.
Yeah, and I think for me, from the how in phase 1, it's very much about co-creating that compelling vision. If there was ever a time to involve people in helping to create what that future looks like, it's right now. And yes, you ask 100 people, you're going to get 100 different answers, but actually it's about pulling out the key themes and making sure that you use those when shaping that vision and that future plan. For me, a big one is something that's very close to my heart is language, is making sure that we just get away. Let's use this as an opportunity to get away from business language, to start using the language that connects with people in their minds and in their hearts, because that's so important. Being purpose-led, being really compelling, thinking about it from the perspective of not just the employer, not just the organization, but the employees as well. Consider your people as part of the solution and not necessarily part of a problem that has to be gotten around.
Yeah. It's a real opportunity, isn't it, Scott, to inject some energy and co-creation in this phase. So from the survey work, for instance, and the focus groups we've done with people, it's amazing that even though people are zoomed out and they're tired, they get very energized by this topic about, well, what do you think it should be like in the future? And what do you think, could be done? What lessons are you bringing forward? So don't underestimate that energy, capture that energy. And the products, I suppose, or the outcomes of this first phase are that there's some sense of a future work model, if you like, a vision and a story that goes with it, that there's a high-level transition strategy, and that there's this business case for change. It's a solid foundation, if you like, in which to move forward. And that brings us to the next stage, that if we have kind of come up with a story and somewhat of a model, then we probably then need to get some manners around that to start to scope out what that means in terms of a transition, and also how we're going to maybe test some of the assumptions we've made. If, for instance, we've said that, look, we're aiming towards a model where people should be, hopefully, where the role permits 2 to 3 days in the office would be the kind of norm. In other words, 2 or 3 days remote. Let's test that. Let's see, does that work? Where does that fall down? Let's learn from that. Persona analysis, taking some principles from design thinking, the most common way we've seen of that being done. Activity analysis at team level, sort of a ground up, if you like, analysis where phase 1 was a bit top down, maybe with some employee input, but now we're actually really getting bottom up input, management engagement, teams getting involved in, how would this work in reality? Let's look at it. Let's test it. Let's kick the tires around it with it. Let's learn from it, rather than pretend that there's some perfect answer there. So it's about really fleshing out what that's going to look like, agreeing maybe then some rules. We might have to go back to some of our principles and say, actually, there's no way we can do X, Y, and Y because, it's just not going to be feasible. We can't have everybody coming in on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays. What are we going to do about that Monday, Friday thing, etc. And also it'll help through the voices and activity of people themselves. You'll start to get what are the barriers, what are the issues, what are the blockers, the enablers that people are saying, and skills that they need in order to be successful. So they're the kind of chunks of work, if you like, that have to be done as we prepare for transition into the next phase.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And for me here, the key word is flexibility. In great big flashing letters, flexibility. It's about, providing, and it was Jim Egan, who's a senior comms guy in Kerry, North America, who talked about this, providing freedom and a flexible framework. We don't know all the answers yet. And this whole situation is so fluid that we're going to have to build something, mark out the pitch, mark out the white lines of chalk, set the expectations, be clear about objectives, but keep the model flexible enough that as things change, your model can flex and change with it as well. You're also thinking about, making sure that flexibility extends to teams. That before now, we've been reasonably rigid in organizations about telling people what had to be done, about doing that in a way that was very directive. Actually, now that we've marked out the pitch, that we've set the direction, we just let people get on with it. And I think that's really, really important. And of course, that comes back to the objective setting and making sure that people really clearly understand the purpose and vision of the organization, how that cascades down into objectives at an organizational level, and then down into objectives for the team so that they can see that red thread all the way from somebody working on the front line in a bank branch in Ballina all the way up to the very top in the CEO's office back in Dublin or wherever they might be based. This is going to take, and it's a word that Kevin used earlier on, a bit of vulnerability from leaders and a bit of honesty. And that's not just your local people leader, that's all the way up the organization. So set the scene. When I talk about language before, we're going to try this. We're going to try this approach. It might not work. And if it doesn't work, we'll try something else until we find the thing that does work. So if we find something's not working, don't get disheartened. Don't get annoyed. Don't get angry. We'll just try something else because the world is changing so much and we've got to put in place a framework that can change with it. I think the last point here is listening, is having that listening ear, listening to what your staff and your organization needs and wants. It's one of the 4 cornerstones of really strong employee engagement. And if there was ever a time to turn on that listening ear, it's right now.
I think this is a great phase actually for to deal. I see some really brilliant challenges and questions coming through on the chat, and a lot of discussions about how do we challenge maybe behaviors, how do we challenge culture, and how do we redefine, if you like, some of those for the future. And I think this is the stage we can really experiment with that, because one of the things we know is that we're not trying to move from, when we change culture generally and behaviors, we're sometimes moving from a very previously successful model where there's a lot of it maybe ingrained, if you like, thinking and habits and patterns of behavior. And we're trying to, maybe we see that there's things moving in the market and we're trying to shift the culture towards sort of a target kind of culture. Here, it's going to be different anyway. We've been given this opportunity around reshaping cultures and behaviors around the new hybrid model, which is going to be new. It's not a choice. It's going to change anyway. So we can get very practical now in team sessions, focus groups, cross-functional departments, as has been said here as well. Get them around, get them involved in what are the habits and behaviors that are going to make hybrid model successful? What are some of the habits and behaviors maybe we've had in the past that will block it from being successful? And actually be vulnerable and open about that. That's this kind of experimental, feedback, open, psychologically safe type of culture and environment that this second phase really requires, because it's going to change anyway. So we're not threatening anybody's previously successful norm, because it's going to be different anyway. If you're saying that 2 or 3 days of people's time are going to be out of the office, you're talking about a new model of work anyway, and it's an opportunity to recast. So we're really looking at the second phase at trying to tie down what that new model would be like and trying to surface these cultural behaviors and change issues from teams in order to transition to the next phase, which is what this is. And this phase being all about, if you like, enabling people for a successful sort of transition. Looking at maybe one or two, not trying to solve for every part of the culture dilemma, but maybe there's 2 or 3 max signature behaviors or patterns or habits that we know will underpin success in the hybrid world. Let's focus on them. Let's really train for them, enable them. Other things will have to go aside, or as a result of success at the first 2 or 3, there will be a knock-on effect to other aspects of the culture. So prioritization of some key cultural and process attributes that are really going to help us succeed. Giving managers a playbook for success, for learning, for iteration, and starting to execute a rollout plan, but build in with measures and feedback. How did that happen? Did it work? We tried that 2 days that week. It didn't work. Fine. No one's going to, be fired because we tried it. We move on. We learn. That idea about transitioning into this new phase in a way that actually is going to be a learning phase for everybody is what this phase is about. And also bringing in some of the technology pieces that Scott was talking about. We know that technology, for instance, is going to be a very important leveler, so that for folks who are actually calling in from outside the office and those who are inside, we can't have it that becomes a privileged place to be in and being an outsider and isolated from outside. We need to have technology as being an enabler, if you like, and a leveler, a platform by which everybody, no matter where they are working from, is participating and co-creating work.
Yeah. And I think, to carry on the sporting analogy, if phase 2 was about marking out the pitch, then phase 3 is about handing over the ball. Just saying to teams, what it is we need to get done. Broadly the lines within which we expect people to work, because that's what we've all agreed. Here's the ball, go out and get it done. And that empowerment, of course, does mean in some ways providing tools and training and experiences to let them get on with succeeding within that framework that you've set out in partnership with them. Yes, a bit of leader upskilling is going to be required. And we also talked a lot before about managing performance expectations and particularly managing underperformance, because, it's the person that isn't pulling their weight, isn't doing their work while they're working, 3 days a week at home. When that's not taken into hand, when that's not sorted out, then that starts to undermine the entire model. So making sure that performance management is a core part of what you do going forward, for me, is absolutely key. One last piece, that whole piece of kind of encouraging and facilitating peer learning, not just within teams, but across silos. We're still really siloed as organizations. But how can one team help to explain to another team in a different part of the company or a different part of the country or a different country what they've done and how they've done it and how they failed fast and how it worked for them in a different way? What channels do we need to put in place to help to make that happen? So really important for me there.
Yeah, no, I think this phase is a real opportunity to almost transition to a new working model and ways of working, with the intent for that to be continuously changed, if you know what I mean. So it's not like we're trying to implement this perfect template that, is going to then finish and be set up and mature from day one. We're actually implementing something. I think an important point too is integration here, that we're coming up with new ways of working, innovation, collaboration, that are not just about implementing a new back to office, if you like, model, but actually they are serving other things that we want to do as a business. We are showing that we can do innovation in a very different way, or being very deliberate about innovation. We're being very deliberate about what we use the office for. We're being very deliberate about the type of work that's best done off-site. And these are helping with our business planning, with our transformation work, our culture changes, etc. So it's much more than just about implementing a new model of work. It's about stitching this in with the type of organization we want to be. So the last phase is, I guess, is really about maintaining momentum. To keep up Scott's sports analogy, if the ball has been handed over, well, let's keep playing. Don't lose focus. Continue to experiment. And I do think, for me, one of the greatest opportunities of this next phase is not that we successfully transition, not that we transition to a successful post-COVID work model, but in doing so, we're actually building a new working culture, ways of working, new feedback-based, strong servant leadership type environments, which will enable us not just for this change that we're going to go through, but will actually set us up for ongoing change and agility into the future. That's, I think, the biggest message for me, at least in terms of this transitionary phase, is not to feel we need to force all this change and get it done and get people back to the office, but actually use it as a vehicle for learning, adapting, new ways of working, new ways of leading for the ongoing changes that will inevitably occur. So that's what this sort of fourth phase is. We don't want to make it feel like it's finishing out. So that's our kind of framework, so to speak. It's kind of one that you could adopt. There'd be lots of 1As and 1Bs, maybe, and 2As and 2Bs in it. But we hope that it maybe helps to just try to capture both the what and the how of the next phase and chunk it up into a relatively intuitive kind of work program to help you on your way in terms of planning this next phase. And also that it's helping to build a sustainable. So we think about, we've practiced in the last year what is technically feasible in terms of remote work. We know what might be desirable from an employee point of view. The question is now, what is sustainable from both a business and an employee perspective regarding this new world of work? And perhaps you could comment on that sustainability point as well.
Yeah, Scott. I think it's something, Kevin, that the organizations have really struggled with, not necessarily being seen to be sustainable, but from my perspective as a communicator, creating the link or the red thread between the things that are being done, the things they're doing in their organizations, and what sustainability means, and telling that story through example. So if you think about a future working model, if you think about a model which is hybrid or flexible, where you've maybe got people who can live in other parts of the country, where they're not traveling to work, where they're not getting in their cars or getting on public transport, where they're staying local, then that's a really big tick in the E box, the environmental box of ESG. So, you know, it's one of those things. However, as you said earlier, Kevin, you know, we've got all these offices in town which are carbon neutral with nobody in them right now. So completely going against the grain. And with empty carbon neutral offices, we've got people at home burning carbon. So, you know, there's something to be thought about there. From a social sustainability perspective, the S in ESG, you know, we've got people staying in, you know, areas and places and possibly down the country and villages and towns that they're now staying in more and spending more money. There's your social sustainability. And of course, from a governance perspective, just thinking about when you're going through this process, how do we involve the needs of everybody in the organization? How do we make that happen? So really, really important to create that red thread, to use this opportunity to really show how you're bringing your sustainability projects and initiatives to life.
I really like it. And, you know, speaking of climate and heating oceans and things like that, I guess one thought from us is that, and I certainly, when working with teams, sometimes there's a sense of being overwhelmed maybe by what's ahead, if you like. And the fact that, geez, I thought we'd done well to kind of get everybody working in remote. I mean, the effort that the HR community and the technology community, for instance, have done to enable the last year's working life, if you like, has been huge. And here we now are talking about this major program again. And I guess one thing is being kind. Hopefully we've learned a bit of compassion over the last year. And I think if we can take that lesson forward about, well, how do we chunk this up? How do we start this journey with a view to keeping going, and just maybe make sure that we focus on what's necessary, but leave the door open for further change as we go, and to build the agility muscle, if you like, from the start, without feeling we have to reinvent every process and every policy for day one. And for an example here with one client on the culture side that's come up a lot in the chat, they felt that the challenge for them, the number one cultural challenge for them in the go forward world was going to be getting that balance between allowing flexibility and autonomy and empowerment on one hand, and having, if you like, a performance and accountability and responsibility on the other. So it was dealing with quite a sensitive issue about how do we know work is going to get done? How do we measure work being done in the hybrid world? How do we offer flexibility on one hand, but still demand accountability on the other? In a hybrid world, that was going to be far more tricky, if you like, than in a more presenteeism, office-based environment where traditional structures and processes were helping to manage that process for them, and traditional performance management metrics. So they felt that amongst all of the cultural and behavioral and process issues they could choose from, and there was many, that was the one they were going to try to deal with over this transitionary period. And that was going to have a knock-on effect to others. So it's just an example maybe of how we decide to maybe what's our 21 plan, what's our 22 agenda, what can we do successfully to get started on this journey, and what are the one or two habits and cultural attributes that we're really going to work on to make this hybrid working model a success, and that really does capture the opportunities that we've all been talking about this afternoon.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kevin. Let's go back 600 years, back to where we started, because, you know, we've said it a few times now, this is, we believe, a once in a lifetime, once in a generation or multi-generational opportunity to change businesses for the better, either a big bit or a small bit. That will depend largely on your business. And as we piece the world back together for this next phase going forward from perhaps September, with the government telling us that, you know, we'll all be back in offices by then, we have a few options. We go back to where we were on the 12th of March last year. That might be exactly what some businesses need, to Kevin's point back at the very top of the session. We might want to kind of continue as we are and have been for the past 12 months. There were a few people in the survey that said we were going to have fully remote. That's completely fine. Or it might be a combination of the two. I guess the biggest thing for us is going to be this. You know, as people, you are here because you are probably in many ways driving this agenda, or are a key part of driving this agenda. So the question to you is this: in 3 years' time, what will your legacy of this period be? Challenge yourself to think about that. In 36 months' time, looking back, what will you have done to create something that you can stand over and say, that was an amazing decision, it was an amazing plan, it was something that created a step change for success in our business? If you enjoyed this chat, I was lucky enough to have Kevin on my podcast a couple of episodes ago. We had a really good chat, really insightful, some really practical insights here, which builds on a lot of what you saw today. And actually, in fairness to Kevin, was the genesis for today's event. After that discussion, why don't we do something where we can maybe share a bit of our learning together? So you'll find it there, inspiringchange.ie/podcast, or wherever you find your podcasts. Just search for Building Better Cultures. Kevin, do you want to close out?
No, just to thank everybody. I know it's gone over time. Really appreciate it. Love the support. I think that core message is that we're all in this together. So let's find ways to share information and get ourselves through this next phase. And you know, that's certainly what we're trying to do here. And maybe follow with us or stay in touch with us so that we can continue to do that and reach out and involve others along this path as well.
Yeah, and thank you for me too, just for being here to take the time out of your day. I know everyone's mental, to take the time to be here, to give us all your wonderful feedback. Thank you so much. I hope that was of help. We will be sending out a copy of the slides, a link to a recording of this event, and also a copy of the framework to each of you. So thanks very much for being here. We're going to hang on for a while. If anybody does want to stay, I've let you turn your mics back on again. If you have any questions, we'll hang here for the next few minutes. And yeah, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.